Welcome to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. I'm Amanda.
And I'm Elizabeth. Thanks for joining us today.
It's time for a weather update. So, of course, we have Dr. Aaron Wilson as our guest today. Hey, Aaron.
Hey, Amanda. Hi, Elizabeth.
So tell us what you do for any new listeners.
So I am an atmospheric research scientist. I hold a joint position at the Byrd Polar and Climate Research Center on the West Campus of Ohio State. And I'm also the climate specialist with OSU Extension and the Agricultural and Natural Resources Group. So I like to talk about weather and climate, and certainly anywhere where that interacts with agriculture across the state of Ohio and the Midwest.
Yep. And as you often point out, most people in agriculture love talking about weather. So it's a good position to be in.
Yeah, absolutely. Farmers are the best. They're on top of the weather, obviously, and being impacted by it on a daily basis. So yeah, that makes us friends.
So the spring wasn't too bad compared with what we've had the past few years. So we'll look back at that a little bit. It did provide some headaches, a little bit of replant. Talking with a farmer yesterday, we decided we're really ready for something normal in our lives. We were hoping it would be the weather. So we'll get into the forecast and see if that's something that might happen. What I want to touch on first is a change in what the National Weather Service considers the normal period, because we're going to look back here at spring in a minute. So when you refer to that normal period, it's different than what we've talked about in past podcasts or your past presentations, correct?
Yeah, that's correct. And so in the 1930s, National Weather Service and NOAA started looking at these 30-year windows in terms of describing what they call average conditions, right? So whenever we talk about comparisons to average, we have to have some time, some period that we're comparing, say, current conditions to. And so the National Weather Service uses this 30-year window. But that window, first of all, it's important to note, this was never designed to be reflective or necessarily capture changes, overall changes in our climate. The assumption when this was brought about in terms of practice was that the climate is static and doesn't change. And so it provides a stable kind of baseline for comparing our conditions. But in fact, every 10 years, we update those normal periods. And so we have just transitioned now from our previous period, which was reflective of 1981 to 2010. And now we use 1991 to 2020 conditions.
So, I personally don't like to think about how 1991 has been 30 years ago now. But I have a hard time remembering what things were like back then, and definitely don't remember what things were like back in 1981. So could you give us an idea of, how different the new normal is from the old normal?
Yeah, certainly. So, essentially what we've done is we've removed the 1980s decade and we've added the 2010s decade. And I think if we reflect over the last 10 years, I think of immediate, what pops out immediately is just how wet it has been. If we think about eight of the top 10 wettest years in Ohio's history back to 1895 have all occurred since 1990, right? So just by chopping off the 80s and adding that more recent period, we would expect a big jump in precipitation. And that's certainly what we've seen across the state of Ohio for an annual average. Our new normals now are about 5 to 10% increase in the annual rainfall. So for instance, here in central Ohio, we've increased around 2 inches, a little more than 2 inches of rain per year now as our new normal. So right around 41 to 42 inches of rainfall. So a lot of places, across Ohio really bumped up a good 2 to 3 inches in that normal amount of rainfall. And of course, the other aspect is that 8 of the top 10 warmest years have also occurred since 1990. So we've increased our temperatures as well. And across the state, it's anywhere from 0.5 degree to 1 degree Fahrenheit on the annual temperature. And again, we talk about this all the time, weather and climate. From a weather perspective, 1 degree, we don't even blink, right? A lot of times. But from a climate perspective, in terms of a long-term average, that's a significant increase. And there are seasonal changes that we've seen that are even larger. For instance, overnight temperatures are a lot warmer. Spring temperatures are a lot warmer. fall temperatures are a lot warmer. And so, even though this tool was never designed to kind of indicate changes in climate, clearly there's been a change in this normal period by dropping the 80s and adding the 2010s.
Yeah, I'm not sure how I feel about that. I mean, I get that like 30 years is a long time. And a lot of times, like, I probably wouldn't use a fact sheet from the 30 years ago or whatever. But I'm concerned. I feel like we've made some headway with the climate change discussion. It's become less political and we've seen the science behind it. But how will that affect as you talk to people about averages and changes? Do you see that having a big impact on that discussion?
There's been quite a strong push, certainly through the media and through NOAA, to get information, educational materials out about the changes in the normals, and to highlight those changes that I just talked about here in the state. I think it's just one more piece of evidence from a scientific evidence standpoint that, we're seeing changes. We've seen changes, pretty big changes over the last 20 to 30 years. I think it all comes down to purpose. In other words, what are we using these windows for? A lot of times now when you talk to municipalities or villages that are thinking about things like storm drainage, for instance, and they're thinking about the size of water infrastructure, does 30 years ago, is that really reflective of the changes that we've seen over the last decade? And should that be used as a basis? For instance, NOAA came out with a 15-year normal set here as well. The idea being, for those that need more up-to-date information, I think agriculture could be one of those. What's just happened over the last 15 years that is more maybe closer to the average that we've experienced over that 15-year period. I'm always, it's always important to talk about, again, that baseline. I think what we do now is from a climate perspective, is we compare what it's like today, say over the general 100-year mean of the 20th century, or what it's like today compared to the 1930s or 1920s. We always have to reference some period of time that we remember or have scientific evidence about that period. All the while, climate's, the background warming and the climate's changing, and we're observing our Earth a lot more than we did in the past 150 years ago. So all of those things have to be taken into consideration.
I think that's one of the things when we talk about, comparing everything to normal in the recent years, normal just is the variability that we see. And it's kind of insane to think the extremes that we've experienced just over the last few seasons. Which moves us right into the next thing that we want to talk about, which is the recap of what we've seen this spring. And, we did get a break from what we've seen the last few years, which is exciting in some ways, but really underscores that variability that we just keep seeing year over year. So what did we just experience, Aaron? And then, how has that affected what we've been trying to get done in the field these last few weeks or month or so?
Yeah, so I think, again, when we think about what our normal is, normal are dramatic swings in temperatures, and we've certainly seen those. This was the 12th, we had the 12th warmest March on record, going back to 1895, and a fairly warm April as well. But we know what happened in May. We actually ran 2 to 4 degrees below average in May. So again, that can cause some issues, especially since in May, we also had some pretty late freezes again after a very warm start to the season. So, dropping down below freezing, even in central Ohio around the 13th of May, and mid-20s around the 15th of May up in Wassee and there in Fulton County, and with frost even reported in Cincinnati on May 30th in Cheviot from a Coco Ross observer there. And so, again, these dramatic swings in temperature were certainly part of our springtime. But I think that there were windows of opportunities this year, especially with the lack of rainfall, the overall lack of rainfall throughout the season. And so that I think is the big difference compared to the last several years, is we did not have nearly as wet of a spring as we've seen, certainly in 2017, 2018, and 2019. Spring was fairly dry, not something that we're used to. We had about 5 inches across the north and about 15 inches in parts of Brown and Adams County, for instance. So a pretty wide range overall for the spring. And if you remember back in a few months ago, I was forecasting a wet spring, right? And so, we can get into what happened there. We talk about the La Nina conditions, for instance, which often bring a weather pattern that's conducive to more rainfall. Even though we had the La Nina, which is cooler sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean, that atmospheric pattern, sometimes there's variability in that as well. And it just did not set in as strongly. And really, we avoided a lot of that rainfall. So April ended up being the 30th driest on record for the state. So that allowed, I think, we had some warm-ups in soil temperatures. We got some crops in, and then, man, it got really cold. Matter of fact, we had heavy snowfall there, up to 7 inches in Cleveland, very late in the season in May. So again, these ups and downs and the extremes, that's here to stay, right? As far as what we kind of forecast into the future.
Yeah, and I think our biggest concern now, you mentioned just 5 inches of rain across Northwest Ohio, and we're heading into what's typically been a drier season for us. So that's probably a concern with a lot of people. Are we going to have enough rain to get us through the summer and have a decent crop?
Yes, and that is a very, I think, important question to ask right now, as we have now switched into meteorological summer as of June 1st. Certainly the cool conditions in May with a little bit more rainfall allowed us to avoid even worse conditions. So that kept evaporation down. So what precipitation did fall was able to soak into the ground. Overall, we didn't have as many of those extreme downpours that we've seen. And so we didn't see a lot of runoff. And so that's also a good indication. But because we, especially across Northern Ohio, since we've been dry really since late summer last year, a lot of the deeper water, the deeper reserves in the soil, we don't have, we're heading into a summer now where we don't have those really deep reserves of water like we've seen in the several years past. And so once that heat builds, as we're already experiencing this week, that heat's really built this week, that water is evaporating very rapidly from the surface, and crops right now need that water to grow. Of course, we want some of this heat, right, to get those crops reaching up. But it's certainly going to evaporate that water fast. And so without the deeper reserves, there's still a little bit of what we call internal memory there in the soil, but not nearly as what we've had in the past. And so that's the concern. If we switch into a period of a consecutive weeks of dry weather, 2-3 weeks, the onset of drought conditions will be very rapid. Right, it'll move in very rapidly and set in, and that's the fear, because overall trends show us that months like July and August, we're talking about this 30-year normal period that we talked about. The months of August or July and August, we've seen actually decreases in precipitation during those months in some areas like West Central and North Central Ohio, and so that's the concern, right? Dry soils usually mean that you don't get as much of that convective thunderstorm activity during the afternoon. Temperatures are higher, it's hotter, and we always say drought begets drought, right? So that's the concern with our soil temperatures right now. Our soil moisture right now.
I think that's been one of the things that really stands out the most about this spring has been, normally by this time of year, we've experienced some storms, some of that severe weather, and we just haven't seen that. We've had mostly clear weather, which this time of year concerns me. I'm glad we were able to get in and get planted, but.
Yeah, that's a great point. The lack of severe weather has been eerie, actually, across the entire Midwest and even the U.S. As a matter of fact, the National Weather Service in Wilmington, Ohio, did not issue a severe thunderstorm warning for their warning area during the month of May. So that's the first time since that office has been around in 1994 that that's happened. And really, I think we've only had one tornado in Ohio so far this year. It was on the Pennsylvania-Ohio border in Northeast Ohio. So, quite a lack of severe weather for certain. And we just haven't had the Gulf of Mexico battling that Canadian cold air. We kind of just were in this stuck cold pattern for most of May, and we didn't have the battle of the air masses there.
That's pretty interesting. I think it occurred to me at some point, we haven't really had any thunderstorms, but I so look forward to the type of rains that we've been having, that it soaks in and we don't have flooding. So I think that was, good to see. But speaking of thunderstorms or storms, I guess, you're predicting hurricane season to be above average, more active.
Yeah, so all of the forecasts coming out from the hurricane experts is certainly more active than average. Again, thinking about those normal periods, but probably not as active as last year. We had 13 landfalling tropical systems last year, over 30 named storms. Ohio dealt with a few. We had derecho from Cristobal and a few things, but we kind of avoided the big damage. But with hurricane season forecasted to be above average as we head into that late summer period around, typically August, the peak is in September. So as we head into the fall season, we could always bring up some of that tropical moisture. And so that's always in the offing and to think about this time of the year. But beforehand, it's tropical season is just getting started now. So we don't get impacted a lot during the month of June and even July. So we really have to pay close attention to just, how much precip that we can get in here, try to maintain that 1 inch per week so we can keep up with the evaporation rates as our temperatures, can't stay in the 50s and 60s all summer long. It has a time or two, but certainly not expected this season.
So Aaron, the thing that all of our listeners have been waiting for in this episode, what do you see in store for the rest of the summer?
Yeah, so, overall confidence is pretty high that this summer will be above average, warmer than average, both during the rest of the month of June here, but also the June through August period. One of the things that, this time of the year I'm always mentioning is those warmer overnight lows than we've experienced in the past, typically because we have more atmospheric moisture around, and that can lead to warmer than average conditions at night, but maybe not skyrocketing temperatures during the summer. However, again, going into this summer with drier soils, the potential to hit those higher extremes because of the lack of moisture in the air is certainly possible. Again, right now, our confidence in the precip forecast is a little low. I would say my confidence is low in the precipitation. Overall, it does kind of lean near to slightly higher than average, which would be good. I think that would keep us from having, any severe extreme drought conditions, minor drought conditions notwithstanding. So that's really what I think we need to pay attention to as we head through the summer. We're kind of in the midst of this first really widespread heat wave. We had a couple of warm days, certainly in Northwest Ohio. By the way, I didn't even mention in Toledo, they hit a streak of 4 days in a row of at least 90 degrees in the month of May. And that's the longest streak since 1962 during the month of May. So that's something that's, we've not gone without heat, even though overall May was cold. But back to kind of this summer, we're, with those drier soils, if we go 2 weeks without rainfall, that's really going to slip us into fast drought, onset of drought, and then probably some extreme warmth as well. So it's really it's kind of a wait and see, right? I mean, it's always a wait and see, but summertime is never a good, an easy time to predict, week to week variability. That's certainly going to be a part of it. But I hate to keep harping back on the fact that we have drier soils, and that's really going to dictate what happens this summer.
Well, we appreciate you giving it your best shot. We certainly understand. I mean, just like the La Nina was in place, but it didn't lead to anything as far as weather goes. So it's hard for me to understand not having that meteorological background. But we all kind of know that it can be hit or miss. It doesn't do what you want it. The weather doesn't do what you want it to all the time.
Yeah, and I think we have a good sign, a good signal this week. We're coming off this heat wave. We're expected to cool down a little bit. So the variability is nice. If we're not just stuck in a pattern, then we can get a little bit more rainfall and have periods of relief as well, which will help. But everything in balance, right? Everything in moderation. That's what we like.
Why don't you hit us with your resources, Aaron? Ways people can follow you and get more information, that kind of thing.
So we have some information through the State Climate Office of Ohio's website, climate.osu.edu. We're in the midst of doing some transition there to provide a little bit more targeted information. Facebook and Twitter are good resources. Dr. Wilson's Weather on those, and also the State Climate Office website, Facebook site. We do during the summer growing season. It'll be a bi-weekly 2-3 minute update on the weather. Certainly be following along with the soil moisture and the summer outlook there. So if you want to follow along, those are all great resources. And you can always send me an email, wilson.1010@osu.edu. Always love to chat weather and climate. So appreciate the opportunity as always to be on this great podcast, and love what both of you do here for the state of Ohio. Thanks.
Well, a little bit of bonus content. We know, Aaron, you like to always include some fun facts in here, and the cicada emergence has interesting ties to the weather and the climate. So do you want to give us a quick update on the cicada emergence before you go?
Well, sure. A little background. I grew up in Miamisburg, Ohio, so Southwest Ohio. And so the cicadas, the first time, 1987, was kind of a fundamental event for me. I absolutely love them. 2004, had them all over the place. Now I'm in Central Ohio and I can't find any, except if I go to, say, High Banks or some of the state parks. So I'm a little disappointed because I really wanted to be surrounded by these things. I absolutely love them. But it was pretty interesting. Over the Memorial Day weekend, I was down at Caesars Creek in Southwest Ohio, and it was quiet, right? Absolutely quiet because of the cold. Obviously, they don't sing and mate in the cold. They like it to be a little bit warmer. Of course, with the heat last week and this week, they're out there singing their hearts out for sure. So, Southwest Ohio will keep them around for the next couple of weeks, and then they'll be gone in that part of the state for the next 17 years. So they're certainly tied to weather. We expected them about 2 to 3 weeks earlier in the emergence, but with those cold snaps that we had in May, it just kept them underground. That soil temperature needs to be around 64, 65 degrees. So like everything else on Earth, they're impacted by the weather patterns, and kind of ensures that someone will always at least want to listen to me at least one time, right? So.
Hey, podcast listeners, just a reminder to give us a like or subscribe so you know when we release new episodes. If you're enjoying the podcast, be sure to leave us a review also. We appreciate the comments.
Thanks for listening to the Agronomy and Farm Management Podcast. Join us again in 2 weeks for our next episode.